Edwin Crawford was in the middle of the desert when suddenly a white-haired girl fell from the sky. Landing directly in his arms, the heroine, completely bewildered and understanding nothing, urgently tried to free herself from his arms, but the protagonist had no intention of letting her go, since finding a bride had been difficult enough as it was, and what would happen if she tried to escape? Upon hearing this, the girl felt even more confused and looked at him in bewilderment. A few seconds before, she had barely felt any pain, suddenly while she was traveling on a bus, and since then everything was a hazy blur. Looking towards the horizon, the heroine didn't understand how that desert had appeared in front of her. She decided to first ask him who he was and where she was. Edwin Crawford looked at her with a smile and introduced himself, calling himself the owner of the entire West. Upon hearing his name, the girl immediately remembered the ruthless villain and the mad killer from an adult romance novel she had read before. He was compared to a dragon. He killed everyone indiscriminately and obsessed. He would kidnap white-haired people to torture them. Normally only the elderly had white hair, but the heroine of the romance Lillian had it because of an illness, and Edwin kidnapped her. He would torture her but soon fell in love, and it all ended with her death at the hands of the prince, the true protagonist. The heroine, for her part, was horrified and didn't understand how she had ended up in that man's hands. Meanwhile, the protagonist ordered his soldiers to take care of the enemies who were still alive. Looking to the side, the girl saw some people, tied up with red eyes, who were staring at her. She immediately recoiled in horror towards Edwin's shoulder, who determined that his fiancée had quite a soft heart, but nothing could be done about it, and ordered Beryl to hand it to him. Taking the large two-handed sword with one hand, the hero headed towards the enemies, holding his utterly terrified fiancée with the other, who was squirming restlessly on his shoulder. She suddenly realized that she also had white hair. At that very moment, Edwin made a swift movement with the sword, and the girl saw blood splatter in all directions. Noticing that she was feeling nauseous, the hero concluded that she also had a weak stomach. Anyway, the important matters were already settled, and it was time to return home. Edwin sat his fiancée directly in front of him on the horse, and she didn't understand what sins she had committed. Falling into a romance novel is surprising enough, but to also have white hair. After a while, they arrived at the Duchy of Crawford and headed to the enormous castle of His Grace. Upon entering, they were received by a man in a suit who calmly greeted his master. The heroine immediately understood that this man was Edwin's confidant by the name of Seth Million. In the novel only, he greeted and saw off the Duke. When Edwin is in a bad mood, he can kill someone, so they had agreed on that beforehand. Looking at her carefully with his calm gaze, Seth was interested to know who she was. The Duke smiled and joyfully announced that she was a long-awaited gift from the gods and his fiancé. Terrified by the butler's ominous gaze, the girl trembled and hid behind Edwin's back. As he took her in his arms, the protagonist confirmed that the heroine had a sensitive heart and a weak stomach, so he should be more delicate with her. A few minutes later, they were left alone in the room, and sitting in his arms, the girl begged for forgiveness. She hoped the Duke would have mercy and put her on the floor, but he wasn't even considering it, as finding her had been extremely difficult. Upon hearing that she definitely wouldn't escape, he laughed and tapped the tip of her nose. The heroine screamed at the top of her lungs, which saddened him a little, as it wasn't scary at all. She wanted to explain to His Grace that it was out of surprise, but she suddenly heard the request to call him by his name. At the same time, he wanted to know once and for all what his fiancé's name was. However, she had no memories of this body's past life, and didn't even know who she was. At the same time, she didn't want to reveal her real name from the real world, and unable to bear the tension any longer, she decided to confess that she didn't know her name, or why she had fallen from the sky. Touching her chin with his fingers, and looking thoughtfully into her eyes, the protagonist wondered if the gods had perhaps sent him a test. However, her ruby-like eyes and white hair made it clear that she was his fiancée. Although the girl's amnesia intrigued him, he decided it would be even more fun this way. Now, Edwin could fill her thoughts only with himself, which made her scream again. Afterward, he decided to invent a name for her until her memory returned. After thinking for a few minutes, he decided his fiancée would be called Angelica. He hoped that his angel and divine gift would like that name, which surprised the heroine even more. If something fell into Edwin's hands, he never let it go, and the only way to escape his clutches was to die. According to the novel, his prisoners suffered endless torment, and during the unbearable pain, they could only beg for a quick death. Angelica imagined with horror that the same fate awaited her. Meanwhile, the protagonist didn't understand what his fiancée was thinking about so anxiously. In reality, in the novel, he never called the kidnapped blonde girls his fiancée, so the heroine gathered her strength and decided to find out why she was the exception. It turned out that Edwin had received an oracle and learned that his life would be very short, unless he married a girl who fell from the sky. In the Assyrian Empire, the nobles and the imperial family received predictions from the oracle, but in the novel only the prince's oracle was mentioned. The Duke spent a long time thinking after receiving his, and finally concluded that God just wanted to joke with him. So he decided to joke back and personally killed all the priests who delivered that oracle. Angelica trembled with fear while Edwin recalled that she then fell from the sky just as the prophecy foretold. Upon learning that she also belonged to the Yabeli family, Angelica was so shocked she almost lost consciousness. After screaming once more, she couldn't believe it, but the Duke knew that only this race could have such light hair. The second sign was her eyes, which resembled precious gems and shone in the light. He considered it very beautiful, but the heroine did not share his enthusiasm at all. The Jewels were a race that inherited the blood of royal fairies and lived in the desert of the Duchy of Crawford. One of the oracles called them bearers of the Empire's destructive destiny, which is why the Emperor initiated a policy of extermination, not suspecting that their deaths would bring a terrible curse. And in the sequel, it was mentioned that this was why monsters began to appear. If the genocide of an entire race was approved by the Emperor, when his secret army of crows found Angelina, they would kill her instantly. Seeing her turn pale, Edwin was stunned and didn't understand what surprised his tender fiancée so much. Upon hearing her fears, his gaze turned cold and furious, and the hero wondered who would dare touch something that belongs to him. The heroine had nothing to fear, and only had to stay by his side, realizing that this scared her just as much as he did. Angelina reluctantly agreed. Seeing how scared his precious fiancé was, Edwin couldn't let her go afterward. He suddenly ordered Seth to bring a knife and the engagement certificate. Of course, he would prefer an official marriage vow, but for now he decided not to rush things, so as not to scare the heroine any further. She clarified that she didn't know why she had fallen from the sky and lost all her memories, and that was why she was scared. Wishing to cheer her up, Edwin decided to clarify that he would be with her every second. Those words struck like lightning, running through Angelina's entire body, because that was precisely the problem. The butler provided everything necessary, as if to confirm if his master truly planned to do it. But the Duke understood that his fiancée was uneasy, and wished to prove that he would not abandon her. Grabbing the knife, he decided to clarify that this was only for him. Bringing the blade to his finger, he wanted Angelina to close her eyes if she couldn't stand the pain. She immediately closed her eyes, thinking they should have warned her beforehand. Upon opening her eyes, she saw Edwin's finger covered in blood as he smiled, bringing it to her mouth. In the end, she had to drink his blood, and the hero offered her a chocolate to bite on. She remembered he had done the same thing to Lillian when he confessed his love. A few seconds later, the Duke watched her attentively, as if expecting something. He was glad that she was all right, and Angelina didn't understand if there could have been a problem. As he picked up the knife again, Edwin smiled and decided it was now her turn. The heroine threw herself hysterically against the back of the sofa and screamed. Remembering his words that the knife was only for him, the hero decided that she must not escape, as he would do everything with his fiancée delicately. He had decided to personally take charge of her safety and happiness. Angelina closed her eyes, and Edwin began to act. After which she screamed in fear, but suddenly she realized he had only pricked the tip of her finger lightly, and he brought it to his mouth. Upon touching his tongue, she blushed with embarrassment and pulled her hand back with a cry. While drying her finger with a cloth, she decided to ask why they had done it. It turned out they had signed a blood contract, and its name frightened the young woman. According to the Duke, the dagger has a magical spell on it, and now their bodies and souls would be joined. Now they could know each other's location and feel if one of them was in danger. Edwin was happy to be able to protect his fiancée at any moment while she mentally said goodbye to her life. Now they just had to sign the contract and it would be done. Understanding that escaping wouldn't work, Angelina realized she wouldn't even be able to read the contract, as she didn't know the local language, but apparently the heavens had given her a bonus gift, for she read the text on the paper with ease. She signed it with resignation and handed it back to the groom, who was absolutely delighted. Then he carried her in his arms to her new room, where opulence and comfort reigned. However, the problem was that they now lived in adjoining rooms, and she decided the Duke intended to spy on her. Edwin, on the other hand, apologized, as he hadn't imagined their meeting would be so unexpected, and didn't have time to prepare. Angelina decided that everything necessary was there, so there was no reason to worry. The hero was perplexed by her words, and chose to trust that if she needed anything, she just had to ask. At that moment, the head housekeeper Sarah arrived, who wished to personally oversee the lady's well-being. Immediately the maid Jenny entered, who would become her personal handmaiden upon marrying the future Duke. The protagonist wanted to get down to greet the servants, but the Duke decided his bride could do it from his arms, as no one would dare judge her even if she did it lying down. Although she had no other choice, Angelina cheerfully greeted the maids, hoping they would take care of her. Edwin considered it was time for her to learn proper manners, as a duchess should not speak to servants that way. The heroine decided to object, since she had not yet officially obtained the title, and in general was not a noble. The hero was infuriated by her words, not understanding how someone dared to belittle his chosen one. Seeing the maid's face turn pale, Angelina hurried to clarify that this was not the case, and the Duke had always been by her side. In that case, he wanted her to stop torturing herself with such thoughts, and to remember that she was the fiancée of the Master of the West himself. Until that moment, she thought that only his eternal smile didn't frighten her, but now it too seemed empty. After a few minutes, she was left alone in her room, and exhausted lay down on the bed. The hero left, determined to invite her to dinner later, and the girl felt a great sense of relief. Suddenly, Jenny's voice was heard, who wanted to prepare a bath for the lady, and Angelina jumped in fright, finding herself in such a world for the first time. She was not used to this kind of treatment and agreed uncertainly. So many things had happened, and she couldn't process it all, so she didn't understand what she should do now. She decided to check her face first, got out of bed and went to the mirror. Seeing in the reflection the crystalline white hair and the sorrowful pearl-like gaze, she confirmed that she definitely belonged to the jewel race. Later she remembered that in the novel Edwin was obsessed with white hair precisely because he was looking for the jewels. However, the reasons were not explained in the book, and the girl was completely disoriented. On one side was the psychopathic groom, and on the other, the bloodthirsty emperor, and it was not clear how to act in order to survive. Edwin, of course, wanted to save her life and even signed a contract with her. A blood contract, but that didn't mean everything would be simple. At the same time, there could be no negotiating with His Majesty and the Duke. Was different as she was his bride according to the prophecy. Angelina still didn't understand why he needed the jewels, but she decided to stay with him, convinced that she would live longer that way. She intended to live a long and peaceful life by behaving as quietly as possible and not getting into trouble. A short while later, she got into the hot bath under the supervision of her handmaiden. Personal. The warm water relaxed her quickly, and the protagonist yawned deeply, realizing she was very tired. With permission, Jenny began to massage her hands, and Angelina immersed herself in the pleasant sensations. Suddenly, the maid wondered what they would do with the ring on her index finger. Looking at it bewildered, the protagonist didn't understand how it had gotten there, or if it had belonged to the previous owner of her body. Suddenly, she noticed an inscription inside and tried to read it. To her surprise, the letters were incomprehensible, and Jenny didn't know that language either. The ornament already seemed ominous on its own, and the inscription only added to the mystery. Could it be that something terrible had happened to the previous owner of her body? And Angelina didn't understand why she had fallen from the sky. Information was scarce, and upon returning to her room, the protagonist collapsed onto the bed in exhaustion. She wrapped herself in the blanket and decided to focus on surviving for now. She fell into a deep sleep instantly. She spent a peaceful night, and at dawn she was awakened by the sun's rays playing on her face. At that moment, she saw Edwin sitting by the bed, who hadn't expected his fiancée to be such a sleepyhead. She let out a scream of horror, and the protagonist interpreted it as a cry of joy. He saw nothing unusual in a husband entering his wife's room, even though they weren't officially married yet. Angelina wondered if he would do this every morning. Upon learning that he would, she fell into a deep state of confusion. Edwin immediately became serious and decided to find out if something was truly displeasing her. The girl screamed in horror again and concluded that her hair was a mess, her face was unwashed, and on top of that she had bad breath. With a laugh while caressing her head, the Duke found his fiancée very cute. He took her in his arms and headed resolutely to their shared breakfast. Later, when they were seated at a table full of dishes, he wanted to know what she would like to try. There was enough food for a dozen people, and the protagonist knew she couldn't eat it all, but it turned out she only had to choose what she liked. Even holding a conversation with the villain made her nervous, let alone eating. After a few minutes, Edwin was very surprised to realize how little his future duchess had eaten. Smiling back at him, she didn't understand how she could have managed to eat anything when he kept staring at her so intently. Meanwhile, the Duke ordered Seth to tell the chef that she liked seafood, mushroom broth, and desserts. Realizing he hadn't even tasted any food and was just watching her as if hypnotized, the protagonist was even more surprised. Upon hearing that the meal was over, she was left completely bewildered, because he hadn't eaten a thing. At first, Edwin was in shock, but then he burst out laughing, finding it very interesting. Angelina simply didn't feel like being the only one who ate. Deciding that she shouldn't worry, the protagonist recalled that his breakfasts were always light and promised to donate more to the temple that sent him such a kind-hearted fiancé. After that, Jenny took the lady to the dressing room to change. The order had arrived urgently, and she had bought the items in a hurry, so something might not fit well, but it could be fixed later. The protagonist expected to see one or two outfits, but suddenly an entire shop opened up before her. The servant was glad to have guessed the size correctly, and would only have to let out the sleeves a little. Then she sat her in a chair and began to do her hair after applying her makeup. Angelina was in a state of deep confusion and couldn't even imagine what awaited her in the future. However, she had no time to lament or deny what had happened, as she had fallen into the hands of a deranged killer. First, she had to increase her chances of survival, and not allow the imperial family to kill Edwin. The main problem was that in the original plot of the novel, it was precisely the crown prince who killed him. He managed to do it with the sapphire sword forged with dragon scales and filled with divine power. Fortunately, Angelina knew where the sword was, and she had to make sure she was the one to obtain it, before the crown prince. Otherwise, not only would Duke Crawford die, but she would as well. After getting ready, the protagonist approached His Grace, who decided that those clothes could not compare to her beauty. Hearing that he intended to buy new ones, she hurried to clarify that what she had was more than enough. Edwin understood that she was being selfless, but it was better for her to just go along with it, since he had decided to give her a gift. He sat his bride in front of the table, and she saw several mysterious purses before her, opening them one by one. He hoped this would remind her of who she was. The Jewel family inherited the blood of fairies, whose power resides in precious stones. And that's why Angelica has the ability to use them. Upon learning she had a talent for releasing power, she hoped to be able to shoot fire. The Duke wasn't sure. But it would probably be a healing ability. She sighed dejectedly, thinking it would be boring. But it was still better than nothing. What complicated everything was that she didn't understand how she was supposed to release the power of the stones. And Edwin didn't know either. The Duke, for his part, was moved by her pouting lips and discontented gaze. He decided to make it her homework, and as a reward for completing it, he promised to grant her one wish. At first, Angelica's eyes shone with hope. But upon hearing she couldn't wish for an end to the marriage promise or to escape, she was immediately discouraged. In the end, she failed to awaken her abilities, and after some time, Edwin unexpectedly took her to the desert. It turned out that the place they arrived at had once been the great home of the jewels. He wanted to see if her memories would return upon coming back to her homeland, the land where the jewels lived. It was called Ambria, and the Duke knew so much about them because they had lived in his territories for generations. Glancing thoughtfully to the side, he recalled hearing many things from his father as a child. Angelina knew this wasn't described in the novel, and the death of the first Duke of Crawford was considered to be related to the imperial family. He died due to the fury of unleashed demons by His Majesty after destroying Hebele. The heroine was troubled by doubts that he could have died so easily. Meanwhile, they arrived in Ambria. The place now looked like an ordinary desert, but according to Edwin, everything was different before. He decided to remind her that they had used gem magic. Most of it was only for healing. However, the protagonist's father mentioned that in Ambria, there were beautiful forests and lakes. Angelina was surprised that the first Duke had been there, but according to Edwin, every head of the family had to visit this place at least once. He was also surprised that his bride asked so many questions today, though she pretended it was just to try and recover her memories. Carrying her in his arms toward a large dry tree, the Duke explained that Ambria was protected by a shield and could not be entered without permission. To outsiders, this place simply didn't exist. The tree in front of them was the guardian of Gebele, and it was precisely thanks to it that the shield was maintained. The protagonist set her down on the ground and pushed her toward the trunk, after which she touched it carefully. Angelina mentally resolved to make it clear that the owner of her body belonged to the race they protected, and had to fight for her life. As she thought that they should remember her, she suddenly felt a strange energy coming from the tree. At that very moment, the heroine's hand felt as if it had seized up on the trunk and she couldn't pull it away. An intense pain shot through her entire body as if every cell were burning with a brilliant flame. Frozen with terror, Edwin hugged his fiancée and felt completely bewildered. He immediately ordered her to take her hand off the trunk, but he only heard pained moans in response, not understanding how that tree dared to harm his chosen one. Suddenly, he heard the shouts of soldiers and the commotion of battle. Crows attacked their group, and the hero decided to momentarily move the girl away to face the enemies. At that moment, she didn't understand or hear anything, feeling as if her heart would burst from the pain. Just then, one of the enemy soldiers began to sneak up on her from the side. Noticing him at the last second, Angeline saw the blade of the sword already heading for her head. She screamed loudly and, without realizing it, called out for Edwin. She closed her eyes in terror and prepared for death, but nothing happened. When she opened her eyes, she saw the enemy's lifeless body fall beside her. The Duke was furious at such audacity and didn't understand how he dared to touch what belonged to him. Leaning toward the heroine, he hoped she was all right and wanted to take care of the crows as soon as possible. In her fear of death, Angeline had forgotten everything else, but now the pain was beginning to return, and she struggled to stay conscious. Edwin decided to make it clear that if she decided to die, he would pursue her even in hell and force her to beg for death. Struggling with stupor at such nonsense, she couldn't help but smile. It seemed strange to her that when the Duke held her, she would calm down completely and feel safe. Deciding she was starting to lose her mind, the protagonist slowly closed her eyes and lost consciousness. When she fell from the sky, Edwin was very surprised, and at the same time, extremely happy. What worried him was that the time, place, and appearance matched the oracle's prophecy exactly. There was only one way to check if she was a jewel, or not make her drink his blood. If an ordinary person drank the blood of the Crawfords, they would writhe in pain all over their body, so the protagonist watched her carefully. Only later, after the blood contract was already sealed, did he discover that his fiancée had lost her memory. The precious stones had no effect, and sitting in his office surrounded by his servants, the Duke didn't know what to do next. Then Seth suggested taking her to Ambria, and at that moment Edwin had an idea. He thought that by facing difficulties in a familiar place, she might remember something, so he decided to provoke the crows into attacking. In any case, they couldn't compete with his strength or his army, so he saw no reason to worry. He prepared carefully and believed he could protect her, but everything went wrong. Running toward him in the middle of the battle, Beryl wished for the master to calm down. Following his advice, the protagonist didn't want Angelina to see him in that state. Turning around in horror, he discovered that she was lying on the sand in front of the tree. He ran to her, lifted her in his hands, and called out to her, begging her to wake up. At least he knew for sure she was alive because the blood oath was still active. Upon hearing from Beryl that they had dealt with the matter of the crows, Edwin hoped no one had escaped, as no one was supposed to know about his fiancée. Upon returning to the castle, he immediately handed her over to a doctor, strictly ordering him not to reveal her information. After her recovery, the hero spent all his time with her, and Seth was intrigued as to whether he might want to go and rest. Sitting on the bed with his bride in his arms, Edwin decided he was already resting even though he hadn't eaten anything. The matter of the crows was resolved, and Angelina was safe, but the Duke's anger had not subsided. He decided he wouldn't let her go under any circumstances. Otherwise, he would lose his mind. He mentally apologized for his foolish plan, hoping she would wake up soon. Meanwhile, a lone cloaked traveler approached the sacred tree of Ambria and observed it intently. He had to wait a long time, but now the moment had finally arrived. Placing his palm on the tree trunk, he suddenly saw a brilliant light envelop him. Meanwhile, the captain of the crows, Kassan, came before the crown prince with a report on another failure. The heir hoped that at least one of the soldiers had survived, but the captain only lowered his gaze and remained silent. Sighing heavily, the crown prince recalled that he himself had chosen Kassan as the leader of the crows. That was why he hoped the captain would not disappoint him again. Bowing his head and vowing to find her, Kassan vanished from the heir's sight in an instant. Although he knew his father would surely protest, the crown prince didn't understand why the old man believed it necessary to get rid of Jewel. After all, it wouldn't be a complete triumph as long as Duke Crawford, who should be eliminated first, was still alive. The Jewel race had been exterminated. What was the point of someone who should have died with her father remaining alive? Besides, Edwin inherited his family's abilities, so the emperor could not enjoy full authority, as long as the Crawfords existed. The Assyrian Empire was a country where power lay with the strong, except in the lands near the capital, which were ruled by the imperial family. The east was under the domain of Duke Peyton, and the west was controlled by Duke Crawford. The south belonged to Duke Chavini, while in the north each region was governed by Archduke Hyzen. Among all of them, Duke Crawford had the most powerful army responsible for protecting the western border. Even without counting his own strength, his army was clearly more formidable than the imperial one. The crown prince understood that if those men remained loyal to the imperial family, there would be no safer defense, nor any reason to fear. However, the heir considered her exclusively his, and did not wish to share his power with anyone. The next day, sitting in front of the protagonist, Edwin suddenly noticed that she opened her eyes. The young woman screamed in terror upon seeing him as expected, but the protagonist was glad that she had woken up before his patience ran out. Angelina was completely confused, and he was intrigued if she had forgotten everything again. Upon hearing that perhaps yesterday had been too painful, she suddenly began to remember how she had lost consciousness from an intense pain. Her whole body trembled, and the protagonist immediately embraced her, trying to calm her. Crying inconsolably on his chest, she was sure she was going to die. After a few seconds, she decided to clarify if that guardian tree was really dead. It turned out that it was and had been for a long time. However, it seemed to the protagonist that the tree was alive, as if it wouldn't let her go. And that searing pain reminded her of the sound of a heartbeat. Smiling, Edwin concluded that his fiancée was truly special. Since even dead trees became greedy with her, he decided to investigate it personally, and then Angelina became intrigued. Who were those people who wanted to kill her? According to the protagonist, they were human crows with red eyes from a secret imperial organization. They emerged during the persecution of Yuli 15 years ago and acted under the command of the crown prince. All the information related to them is shrouded in mystery, and it was known without a doubt that they continued to search for traces of Yuli. Trembling with fear, Angelina concluded that they surely knew of her existence. Just thinking that they would inevitably find and capture her made her world spin. Seeing her dejected state, that was the reason why the Duke hadn't wanted to say anything. Here she had nothing to fear, and the crows could never harm her. The girl once again felt that strange state, which despite her strong refusal to accept it even bothered her. Although she couldn't move a finger, and the pain was unbearable, and the enemy's sword was pointed at her, only Edwin was in her mind. Closing her eyes and lowering her head, she understood with horror that she would have to spend all her time with that madman to survive. Embracing her with both arms, the Duke decided his fiancée had taken on too many problems. Later, the heroine began to think about how she could unlock the power of the gems. She sighed heavily, aware that she had to do it as soon as possible. But there was still no progress. Jenny noticed that the lady had been sighing often lately and decided things could not go on like this. She decided to invite the future Duchess for a short walk in the garden. The girls arrived at a pergola, from which a field of blooming violets could be seen whose beauty was hypnotic. Wanting to prepare a delicious refreshment for the lady, the maid decided to ask if she had a favorite tea or dessert to enjoy in her absence. Angelina wanted to pick some flowers, but suddenly the gardener brought her a full basket. Upon returning with the tray, Jenny was very surprised by the number of flowers and decided to arrange them while the lady enjoyed her tea outdoors. Spreading whipped cream on it and taking a bite, the heroine experienced unparalleled pleasure. Suddenly, the atmosphere of well-being was shattered by the Duke's voice. Happy to have finally found his fiancée upon seeing her satisfied face, he wanted to know what had made her so happy. During his absence, he had never seen her so inspired by his side, and that deeply infuriated him. Seeing that the sweets on her plate were not perfectly shaped, he asked who dared to serve her such an aberration. At that moment, Jenny froze and turned pale with horror, not daring to look up. First, the protagonist clarified that the pastries were supposed to look like that. She quickly spread one with cream and strawberry jam and offered it to the Duke, convinced they tasted incredibly good, while Edwin slowly nibbled the pastry from her hands. She watched him intently, convinced that the combination couldn't be bad. Suddenly the hero laughed and grabbed his head, and Angelina thought that perhaps the sweets were still poisoned. Seeing that he liked them, Edwin gave her a peck on the nose and called her a cutie, surprised that his expression had worried her. Seeing the basket of marigolds in a corner, he understood that the protagonist liked them and decided to plant them throughout the entire garden. However, Angelina didn't see the need to plant them as she liked all flowers, and an awkward silence filled the air. To break the tension, she suggested that perhaps the Duke would like a flower crown. He enthusiastically handed her the basket of marigolds and asked her to make that immediately. The protagonist hadn't expected him to agree so readily and began to make one crown after another, wanting to create a perfect one so as not to anger him. After looking at about a dozen of the finished jewels she made, the hero didn't understand which one she wanted to give him. Upon learning they were all for him, he was delighted and decided to clarify that he would accept any gift from his fiancée. Taking one and placing it on his head, Edwin hoped she would like it. Until then, a frightened Angelina hadn't even noticed how handsome his face was. As he placed one of the crowns on his head, the hero considered the result sublime. Now in this warm and cozy atmosphere, it seemed as if yesterday's events had been nothing more than a nightmare. The Duke was intrigued by what she was thinking, and the young woman feigned surprise at them being a matching pair. As she smiled at him, Edwin decided that she liked wearing matching jewelry. After tea, he carried her back to the castle in his arms. As they went along the garden path, she calmly looked at the surroundings. The heroine didn't understand when she would be able to walk on her own 2 feet again. Suddenly, she saw an unusual tower up ahead and wondered what it could be. The Duke, who had been smiling before, looked over and suddenly became serious, which was alarming. Somewhat bewildered by his grim look, Angelina thought perhaps she shouldn't have asked. Edwin couldn't stand repeating himself, and so he hoped she would pay close attention to what he was about to say. Upon learning that it was a very dangerous place, and that she must not go near it, the heroine concluded that the torture chamber must be there. Upon getting her agreement, the hero immediately smiled and decided she should only see pleasant things. A little later, he returned to his office, where the butler and Beryl were already waiting for him. Upon seeing a small crown of geraniums on his master's head, Seth's jaw almost hit the floor. Beaming with joy, Edwin decided to show off the wonderful gift he had received from his fiancée. The butler considered her very capable, while the hero fondly remembered how she had made them with her small hands. However, it was time to move on to more serious matters, and the Duke was curious about the warning given to the knights and servants. Beryl quickly clarified that they had taken the necessary measures to prevent any problems, and the master had nothing to worry about. Seth decided to confirm if the lady truly remembered nothing, and unfortunately that was the case. And no one knew what to do about it. She seemed to be 18 years old, which meant that when the hunt of Yabeli took place, she was barely 3 years old, but according to the Emperor, there were no survivors in Ambria. The butler decided they could try to find information about her through the sharks. The Duke was not confident in the plan's success, as they hadn't appeared because of the crows in the last 15 years. As for the prince's own soldiers, they continued to search the desert along with tomb raiders. Beryl thought perhaps they were looking for survivors, but Edwin knew for certain that even if someone had managed to survive, they would not return there. Then the servant remembered that it was precisely in that desert that the guardian tree was located. The attraction of tomb raiders is also surprising, and the hero discovered that Gui is still investigating this matter. Looking thoughtfully out the window, he didn't understand what the crown prince was plotting. The next day, the heir to the throne went to the drawing room to meet an important guest. Duke Yabini greeted his highness with a bow and recalled that lately he had heard a lot about his popularity. He found it curious how long the crown prince planned to steal the hearts of the ladies around him. The heir decided he needed to find a partner, as that was the destiny of the future emperor. Moreover, it was a choice for the rest of his life, and so he wanted to approach it very carefully. After the conversation, Duke Savini returned to his palace where he was respectfully received by his butler. The meeting with the crown prince didn't go exactly as planned, but overall it wasn't bad either. He surprised his highness with a gift consisting of scientific watches, which were an innovative invention. The crown prince was impressed by the luxurious design and interesting functionality of this device created by the best artisan in the empire. Suddenly, the heir noticed gems of the highest quality on the man's watches, which surely came from the Duchy of Payton. Duke Shabini was very pleased that 2 dukes of the empire firmly controlled the entire gem industry of the continent. He did not like that his highness mentioned the eastern rulers, who also had a candidate for the position of princess heiress. The butler understood that the crown prince had intentionally brought up that topic. Duke Payton owns a mine, and perhaps it had to do with the heir's oracle. According to it, his highness will obtain salvation if he finds the owner of the gems and wins her heart. Duke Shabini was overjoyed to learn this, as his family had always been considered the owner of the gems. He decided that his daughter Lillian must undoubtedly become the crown princess, and ordered the plan to be set in motion. At that moment, a knock was heard at the door, followed by the voice of a young woman who wished to enter. Seeing his precious Lillian in the doorway, the man was filled with enthusiasm as he sat with her on the sofa. He decided to remind her that his highness would soon choose the crown princess. The young woman jumped for joy and decided to ask if she would be his chosen one. Duke Shabini had no doubt at all that she was the owner of the gems. Considering her father the best in the world, she hugged him tightly. Meanwhile, Edwin gave the order to officially announce his engagement to Angelina. Seth was not sure about this idea, understanding that the crows would intensify their surveillance. However, the hero thought it would be even more interesting that way, and he was excited by the idea of resolving it soon. After a brief silence, the butler recalled that there were a few days left until that moment, and perhaps it would be better to take action. The thoughtful Duke took out his locket and looked at the opal that had cracked in half. Seth decided that perhaps he should inform the lady about what was going to happen, but Edwin decided not to scare her more than necessary, since she had not yet awakened her powers. Angelina was still afraid of everything, even though he treated her well, and the hero did not understand why she behaved that way with him. He ordered the butler not to allow her to leave her room that day, and if necessary, to protect her from any danger. With a mysterious smile placing his hand on the black briefcase, the hero decided that it was best for his fiancée to be prepared to enter the eye of the storm. Upon learning later that Duke Crawford had entered into an engagement the crown prince did not understand. Had he just kidnapped someone or had he made a threat? As for the fiancée herself, the butler Dylan was only able to find out her name by reading it in the report. The heir heard that girl's name for the first time. His butler checked the list of nobility, and that name did not appear among the aristocrats either. It was an advantage since everyone knew about the bad relationship between the emperor and the Crawford family. If someone from the nobility married under those circumstances, it would be a challenge to the entire royal family. However, even if he assumed his chosen one was a mere commoner, why so suddenly? If you choose a girl in the midst of a conflict with the imperial family, shouldn't she be someone influential? Dylan thought that perhaps the Duke had decided to secure an heir, since he seemed to care little about his fiancée's origin. Many generations of his family had been indifferent to bloodline, which is why most of the nobility did not wish to marry them. The butler suddenly decided that perhaps the hero had a physical problem. And then it occurred to His Highness after Jules' disappearance. The Duke's madness must be intensifying day by day. Had he already reached his limit? This explains why he urgently and suddenly needed an heir. However, even so, the prince was left with a strange feeling as if they had missed something important. According to the emperor, the Crawford's curse is passed down from generation to generation, so the heir will receive it too. The prince ordered Dylan to continue the investigation into this matter, and to immediately report all relevant information. Upon learning that the Duke of Shabini had already begun his work, the heir admired him and decided to meet with his daughter soon. Later, when he was alone, he called for his faithful Kassan. Believing something was wrong with Duke Crawford, he wanted the soldier to investigate the physical condition of the hero and his fiancée. Kassan hurried to carry out the order, and the prince decided they should not let anything slip by. Crawford was a true monster, and if they made the slightest mistake, he would cut their throats himself. But this time, the heir decided that he would be the sole victor in the end. The next day, Angelina lay peacefully in her bed, deep in a sweet dream upon waking up and not screaming for the first time at the Duke's sudden appearance. She heard it was time to leave the palace. Since the crows were looking for her, it seemed very risky, but according to Edwin, she was completely safe with him. The heroine knew he would protect her, but wouldn't problems arise if someone found out she was a Yebeli? The hero, with a calm smile, decided that no one would find out. The girl knew that in this world, there was a magic hair dye, but it only lasted a few hours and the hair would look like a broom, which would be even more suspicious. Thinking the Duke was referring to it, Angelina didn't understand if he really believed it would work in the long run. She went to his office, and Edwin kindly invited her to sit next to him on the sofa as she saw him take from the table a beautiful bottle with liquid. She understood that he would really use the dye upon seeing the hero's satisfied face. She was no longer sure it was safe. At first, Edwin wanted to know what hair color she liked, but then he decided to make it golden like his. As soon as the liquid from the bottle came into contact with her hair, it immediately turned a golden color. Moreover, her hair looked nothing like a broom. Instead, she looked like a model from a shampoo advertisement. Impressed with the result, the Duke hurried to clarify that the effect had no time limit. It turned out that this dye was a family secret, and the hair would stay that way until the hero decided to change it. Angelina was very confused, as it was the first time she had heard that the Crawford family could use magic. In this world, there was no magic tower. The number of mages was very small, and they all acted alone. Besides, Edwin wanted to give his bride the family treasure, which could not be used without the permission of the head of the family. He took out the black box and opened it, and inside were contact lenses encrusted with precious stones. Upon putting them on, the heroine, along with her dyed hair, acquired a completely new and different look. Suddenly, she grew curious about whether she could escape with the help of these gadgets. Seeing her thoughtful expression, the hero clarified that she could not use them by herself. Besides, he could reverse the effect at any time, restoring the original eye and hair color. After finishing with those formalities, he was ready to accompany her to the exit. Later, while traveling in the carriage, Angelina decided to ask where exactly they were going. Upon hearing it was the place she would like, she was very surprised. After a while, they suddenly stopped, in front of a very famous jewelry store. The Duke remembered that his fiancée wanted matching jewelry, so he brought her here. Everything would be fine. if not for the fact that Angelina remembered this store belonged to the family of the novel's protagonist, who had charmed Edwin and been kidnapped by him. Although that protagonist was of the Yabeli race, it was impossible to predict what would happen if they met. Upon entering, a receptionist greeted them at the entrance and identified him as Knight Million. Angelina, as usual, was being carried in his arms, and she decided to ask why the hero was using the surname Z. Edwin smiled and thought that if he had come openly, the employees would not have even been able to speak. Since he came with his fiancée this time, he decided to hide his identity so she could browse calmly. Realizing that the hero cared about her, the girl did not understand how such a thing was possible. Soon they sat her at a table, on which they placed different boxes of jewelry. The Duke wanted her to choose what she liked, but Angelina said she would prefer whatever he chose. Suddenly, among all the variety of sparkling jewels, her gaze was drawn to a pair of earrings with an unusual orange stone. It turned out to be a fire diamond, one of the rarest among colored diamonds. Its color reminded her of marigolds, and she could not look away. He abruptly grabbed an earring and brought it close to his fiancée's ear, convinced that it suited her very well. He decided to buy them and sincerely hoped the heroine would enjoy her gift. Blushing slightly, she nodded with a smile, as it could not be otherwise. He took her in his arms again and decided to buy his fiancée everything she needed. Afterward, they went for a walk through the city streets, and at one point, Angelina couldn't stand it. They were attracting stares from all sides, and she hoped that once and for all, allowed her to walk by herself. The Duke saw no need for it as she was completely safe in his arms. But she wished to stroll through her own domains. Finally, Edwin gave in and gently set her down, though it unsettled him when she moved away. That's why they always had to hold hands. After a while, they arrived at the city's central square, and Angelica was impressed by the beauty of the place, in the center of which stood a large pond with a sculpture of a fairy. It turned out that statue was built by the first head of the Crawford family. The protagonist knew that the Yabeli were disliked, and didn't understand how the Emperor had allowed the fairy sculpture to remain. Suddenly, Edwin became serious and declared that no one would dare touch the lands of Crawford. Suddenly, one of the servants approached them, wanting to deliver something urgent to his master. Surprisingly, the Duke stepped away from her for a moment, and she was left alone. She grabbed his clothes with pleading eyes, but the hero still had to listen to his subordinate's words. Stroking her head, he decided there was no reason to worry, as the knights would protect her. Finally, she sat on a bench near the pond, and despite the soldiers who were next to her, she felt uneasy. Suddenly, a ball rolled toward her, and nearby she heard the voices of children who wanted it back. As she picked up the ball and glanced furtively at the knights, the protagonist hoped there was nothing wrong with doing so. While returning the ball to the children, she decided not to let it go, fearing it might fall in a bad place. Snatching the toy from her hands, the boy immediately ran off in embarrassment, leaving the young woman perplexed. As she turned, she accidentally bumped her hand against a passing man, and he apologized immediately, but as soon as he saw her face, the cloaked man's gaze changed, and he looked bewildered. The man couldn't understand why he was reacting that way to this person. As she backed away, it seemed strangely to Angelina that he knew her, or that he had realized she was a Yabeli. At that moment, Edwin approached and hugged his fiancée, and he didn't understand why she couldn't stay still. Turning to the stranger, the hero demanded to know who he was and what he wanted from his beloved. The man looked very surprised, which perplexed the protagonist even more and angered the Duke. A few minutes later, Edwin bought his fiancée cotton candy and had her sit on a bench. Tasting the sweet cotton candy, Angelina calmed down considerably. She wondered if the hero knew that strange cloaked man. Hearing that he seemed familiar, the Duke wanted to know if they had met before. However, she couldn't remember anything, so she couldn't say for sure. Edwin turned to Beryl, hoping they had killed him, but unfortunately he managed to escape. The hero instantly ordered him to be captured alive and brought back, which made Angelina tremble. Smiling at her, he resolved that he would find him soon, and told her not to be afraid. That night, the Crown Prince received a report about how Duke Crawford had gone out personally with his fiancée. In his place, he would have hidden her, but it seems that Edwin intentionally wanted to show off his chosen one. Kassan checked everything himself, and confirmed she had golden hair. In that case, she was definitely not a Yabeli, and the prince didn't understand why the Duke had brought her with him. Could it be that he is actually ill, and for that reason wants to have an heir soon? The Crawfords were always born with golden hair, and he brought a fiancée with the same. Upon learning that the hero's condition was normal, the Crown Prince ordered the surveillance to continue. As for his fiancée, it was not necessary to follow her. However, the doubts had not been completely dispelled, and the heir decided it would be good to meet her personally. Meanwhile, Edwin met again in his office with Seth and Barry. The soldier decided to continue observing the movement of the crows while the Duke asked the butler if there was any news from the sharks. Seth insisted that 15 years ago there were no traces of a child in the vicinity of the Musa's desert. Edwin was very perplexed and didn't understand where his fiancée had been before he met her. On the other hand, even though the Ollies know nothing for now, there is no need to worry about the crows. The next day, the Duke personally placed a necklace with a black opal around Angelicia's neck. Sometimes it's not comfortable to wear jewels on one's hands, so he had it made as a necklace. The protagonist was seeing such a stone for the first time, and it turned out that black opal was the most expensive in its category. Moreover, the necklace bought from the jewelry store had been too heavy, whereas this one would be more comfortable to wear, and she could even train with it on. At that moment, Angelica understood that he was subtly doing it to rush her into action. But on the other hand, it was also important to her, so she decided to try her best. Besides, Edwin wanted to give her rings that they would now wear together, and the protagonist was surprised they were already made. Hearing that the Duke had rushed the jewelers, she understood he had surely threatened them. Picking up the small box with the rings, the hero could no longer contain his impatience to see the result. Inside were works of jewelry art, which had clearly been worked on with great care. Edwin hoped his fiancée would like them, as they were a matching pair, and even though it was a bit late, with all his heart he wanted to congratulate the girl on their betrothal. After placing the rings on their fingers, he decided that now the whole world would know she was his chosen one. Angelica noticed the ring was unbearably heavy on her finger. Perhaps it was for some other reason, as this was a point of no return, and now she would surely never be able to leave the Duke. So instead of avoiding it, she decided to act bravely. The protagonist had to save herself not only from Edwin, but also from the imperial family, and at that moment, smiling wholeheartedly, she was happy that now everyone knew of her engagement to the hero. The Duke was petrified with surprise and looked at her seriously, which made Angelica nervous. Then he hugged her tightly, not knowing what to do when she smiled so radiantly. He was feeling such an emotion for the first time, as if his heart was going to stop, but at the same time it was incredibly pleasant. The young woman, for her part, was in silent shock and didn't understand what was happening. Later, Edwin clarified that he would be away the next day, as the imperial family had drawn too much attention, and tomb raiders had emerged. He also wanted Angelica to spend the night in her room and not go out. Surprised by his words, the protagonist didn't understand the reason. It turned out it was going to be the night of the blood moon, during which monsters appear. As foretold the following night, she saw a large red moon in the sky from her window. She recalled that at some point strange rumors had begun to circulate throughout the world according to which the monsters appeared because of the Yabeli. In the following years, the discontent toward this race spread throughout the empire, and the hatred grew more and more. The young woman didn't understand why the hero had to be away on this particular night. Pressing her face against the window, she understood that one way or another, they would not see each other today. Suddenly she realized that without him she felt so empty and lonely. To think that before she hadn't wanted to see him, and now she was saddened. By their separation, Angelica felt confused. At that moment she stroked the black opal necklace hanging from her neck with her hand. That stone was also a gift from the Duke, and it held a particular charm. The protagonist decided she had to awaken her abilities as soon as possible. Suddenly, she heard a loud crash that seemed to come from everywhere, making her jump. Acting instinctively, she dashed to the bed and hid under the blanket. Suddenly, her heart began to ache intensely as if a burning knife was plunging into it. The protagonist remembered that having signed a blood pact, they could now feel when one of them was in danger. Convinced that something terrible had happened to Edwin, she hurried to gather several gems into a small pouch, pressing it against herself and trying to ignore the pain in her heart. She ran desperately toward the door. As she went out, she immediately collided with Seth, who had decided it was safer for her to remain in the room. Angelica tried to explain that the Duke was in danger, but according to the butler, the master was currently checking the castle's defenses. Unable to bear the pain any longer, she began to scream, believing that something had happened to Edwin. She decided to clarify that she felt this because they had signed a blood pact. Seth had no choice but to listen, and he now understood it was best to comply. When she explained she could detect the direction to his grace, the butler decided to follow her. Running out into the inner courtyard, the heroine suddenly realized that Edwin was in the very tower she was forbidden to enter. Suddenly, she encountered Beryl, who didn't understand how she had gotten there. Upon hearing that she wished to meet urgently with the Duke, he was struck dumb with astonishment and lost the ability to speak. Seth appeared right away and decided he should let her pass, as it was truly an urgent matter, realizing there was no other option, and he would have to reveal His Highness's terrible secret to her. The soldier agreed to take her to the tower. It turned out the entrance was secret and was located right in the middle of the wall. As they climbed and heard strange noises, the heroine thought in horror that perhaps there was a monster hidden there. While she was lost in thought, they reached the top of the tower where there was a small, empty room, lit by a few torches. Suddenly, at the other end of the room, Angelica saw a man, bound to the wall with chains and covered in blood. Paralyzed with fear, she didn't understand where Edwin was, or why such a place existed. At that moment, the chained man began to scream loudly, trying to break free, which frightened her even more. Looking at him and thinking she was losing her mind, she recognized the desperate man as Duke Crawford. She couldn't understand what was happening, so Seth hurried to explain that it was a curse. The descendants of the Crawford family are born with great strength, but are just as unbalanced, and on the night of the red moon their condition worsens drastically. And unfortunately, there is nothing that can be done about it. Angelica stood motionless from the shock, watching the rampaging hero and not knowing how she could help him. She had just accidentally occupied Yabeli's body, and in reality she didn't know how to handle gemstones at all. Gathering her thoughts, The protagonist understood that if Edwin died now, she wouldn't be able to run and hide forever. Besides, his desperate scream sounded as if he were begging for help. Remembering that he had promised to protect her, Angelica felt her fear disappear, replaced by confidence. The hero had always cared for her, and now she couldn't abandon him. In fact, she wasn't Yabeli, but the body's owner was supposed to learn how to handle that power. With these thoughts and the desire to help Edwin, she held the small bag of gemstones in her hands and ran towards him at full speed. Suddenly the stones tore through the fabric and scattered in all directions while the protagonist felt a force enveloping her. It was a very familiar sensation, similar to touching a guardian tree. At the same time, it was something instinctive, as if she were truly necessary for Edwin the Duke. He began to roar furiously, and the servants were terrified for the lady. She got almost completely close to him, and suddenly, Edwin lunged at her like a wild animal, but the next second he suddenly recovered and saw his fiancée in front of him. Angeline caressed his cheek, and decided that she would undoubtedly help him, murmuring his name. Suddenly he felt the pain gently leave his body. It hadn't always been terrifying to be near her and feel the urge to flee, but seeing Edwin's terrified face, she understood she couldn't do it. At that very moment, the young woman lost consciousness suddenly and fell to the floor, leaving everyone perplexed. The Duke caught her in his arms instantly and knelt down. He directed his gaze to her bare feet, which were covered in bloody blisters from running through the castle. Edwin confirmed once again that his fiancée was very weak and couldn't endure pain. Seth and Beryl were deeply confused and hoped their master was all right. In reality, the hero now felt better than ever before. The members of the Crawford family feel it from birth, how their veins throb and their blood boils. Even with Jebeli's black opal, one cannot live peacefully, as it only alleviates the symptoms. However, the physical pain and the desire to kill never completely disappeared. Later, looking at the sleeping heroine, Edwin thought of her as a frightened little lamb. He took a lock of her hair and kissed it, wishing for her to wake up soon. The next day, she jumped out of bed, remembering she had seen the Duke's silhouette while she slept. With a swift movement of his hand, Edwin returned her to the bed, not understanding why she was preparing to leave so soon after waking up. Angelina instantly clutched her head, hoping he was okay and didn't have any pain anywhere. The hero smiled back at her, wanting to know if she had really been so worried about him. She didn't see what was so amazing about that, as his condition had been deplorable. Pressing her tightly against him, the Duke decided that everything was fine now, and he felt excellent. Besides, he now understood the feeling of having someone by your side who is not indifferent to you. He decided to do the same, and asked how his fiancée's leg felt. Upon learning that the protagonist didn't even know she had been injured, he didn't understand why she didn't take care of herself. His hands still smelled of medicine, and realizing that he himself had applied the treatment to her legs, she felt even more confused. However, Edwin simply wouldn't allow anyone else to touch his fiancée. Remembering that in front of her was a psychopathic killer, Angelina thought that perhaps people really do change on the brink of death. Meanwhile, the hero decided to make sure she was okay, remembering that she had lost consciousness the day before. The young woman decided she was perfectly fine until she noticed the color of her hair had changed. It turns out the Duke had changed it, thinking it would look prettier that way. If the effect is completely cancelled, she will look like a reveal and won't be able to escape. However, the protagonist had no intention of running away anyway, since he was in danger. Upon learning that if he died, her hair color would return to the original, she understood she would be doomed if she didn't help him. However, even with that, the Duke didn't want his fiancée to see him in such a state. Angeline hoped to sincerely hear from him why he felt so much pain yesterday. The protagonist recalled that in the beginning, different races existed in the world, and to protect the weakest, God separated humans from the others and forbade them to interact. But one of the dragons disobeyed the order and entered the human world, where he managed to fall in love with a human woman. The angry god condemned their children and all their descendants with dragon blood to an eternal delirium and a short life. The dragon offered his life in exchange for a miracle, and after much thought, God sent his descendants the race of the Jabiel, capable of alleviating the curse. Thus arose this symbiosis in which the Jabiels helped the Crawfords in exchange for their protection. For this reason, each head of the family must visit Emberia at least once to repeat the oath and receive a sapphire. Edwin received it from the previous Duke, but now it was broken in half. The reason was that he went mad upon witnessing his father's death. In reality, it was lucky that, despite that state, it didn't lose its effect, and the protagonist hoped he could hold on a little longer. This was strange because Edwin was doing fine until the Crown Prince killed him. And what changed if Opal was helping him all this time, remembering that in the novel, no one had fallen from the sky into his hands? Angelina thought that perhaps she was to blame for everything. Recalling the prophecy that said precisely that Jewel would bring the red moon and destroy the continent, she suddenly heard gratitude from the Duke. He decided that without her he would surely have died the night before, and he was sincerely grateful for her saving him. However, the girl seemed very surprised, which puzzled him greatly. She was just shocked that Edwin Crawford was thanking her, and perhaps he was truly in pain since he went to such lengths. She resolved to stay with him to help him, and decided that the hero should suffer no more. As soon as she uttered those words, the Duke hugged her abruptly again. Suddenly it occurred to him to wonder if Angelina hadn't forgotten anything. Upon hearing him refer to the stones she had learned to use, the heroine understood what he was getting at. Having completed her task, she could now grant him any wish, except for escaping or getting a divorce. Looking him firmly in the eyes, she wanted a guarantee that she wouldn't die. Edwin was stunned as he always protected her, but it turned out she wasn't talking about crows. She was referring to the Duke himself, which bewildered him even more. She mentally understood that he had a hobby of killing people, but she chose to express it more gently. She recalled his words that he wanted to treat her like his fiancée. She could be in danger if she made a mistake, so he had to guarantee her safety. They were now united by the same destiny, and if he wanted to live a long and happy life, he had to keep that promise. The hero was impressed by her words about destiny, and upon hearing that he was going to fulfill that promise, Angelina was thrilled. At the same time, she wanted to sign a contract, and Edwin didn't understand. Did his fiancée not trust him that much? The protagonist didn't understand how to trust someone who drew his sword for any mistake. So the Duke decided to ask if he had ever broken a promise. To the girl's surprise, it had never happened, but to reassure her, he accepted the contract. That night, the Duke, Peyton, learned from Farron that the Crown Prince had invited Lady Chavini for a cup of tea, understanding that he wanted to observe the families. His Highness considered it very tiresome. Perhaps it was all due to the Oracle's words that His Highness had to find the owner of the precious stones, which was why the two girls were the most suitable for the role of Crown Princess Lady Chavini and Evelyn Peyton. Both families were in the jewelry business, competing and collaborating with each other, and they represented the southern and eastern regions. The Duke did not want to send his daughter to the imperial family. He wished for her to continue the family business, and didn't know how to do so without offending the heir. At that moment, another servant ran to him to announce some terrible news. Lady Peyton was feeling terribly ill, and a doctor needed to be called urgently. A little later, the doctor examined the young lady and concluded that it was in all likelihood a fever. The Duke was confused as his daughter had never had even a mild illness, but the doctor could not yet determine the cause. However, a fever was a fairly common illness, so there was no reason to be alarmed. A while later, he heard that her condition had improved and immediately rushed to her room. Evelyn was already feeling perfectly fine and received her worried father with a smile. She felt awkward for having made him worry, but the main thing for His Highness was that she had recovered. At that moment, the maid opened the curtains and sunlight streamed into the room. Then the young lady suddenly began to frown and cover her eyes with her hands. The father was in shock as she cried out from the pain in her eyes due to the intense light. They had only adjusted the curtains, but she couldn't open her eyes even for a moment. Later, the doctor visited her again and concluded that it might be an after effect of the fever. The Duke was more concerned with how to cure his daughter than the diagnosis itself. The doctor had to clarify that her condition could be improved significantly, but curing it completely would be extremely difficult. Upon hearing this, His Highness and his daughter were stunned, not understanding why or when all this had happened to them. The young lady decided to ask if she could look at gemstones. She sank into despair upon learning that she had to avoid contact with shiny objects. Understanding the gravity of the matter, the Duke ordered the doctor to treat her with all possible methods and resources. Later, Evelyn decided she would become an object of ridicule if anyone found out that the future head of the family couldn't even look at jewels. Her father determined that they should not obsess over personal perfection and that it wasn't necessary for her to verify everything herself as they had reliable assistants. Besides, she had been eating a little for several days, and the Duke wanted his daughter to start eating. A little later, she wanted to ask her father if what her oracle had announced was now beginning. That night, the Duke wanted to clarify with Farron if he remembered the oracle Evelyn had. According to it, if they didn't find the true owner of the staff, their source of minerals, they would lose everything. Meanwhile, the doctor called unexpectedly, and the Duke invited him in. The doctor looked very serious and decided immediately that he would have to perform a more detailed examination of the lady's condition. The Duke was confused. Weren't these normal consequences of a fever? The doctor hastened to clarify that the high temperature and headache were indeed common symptoms. However, during a secondary examination, he identified green spots on her body, and it was the first time he had encountered something similar. The Duke hoped that by identifying the disease, they could cure her immediately. Upon hearing that the doctor couldn't guarantee anything, he let out a resigned sigh and allowed him to leave. Not even a few minutes had passed when a servant suddenly burst in with the urgent news that the Ilia mine had recently collapsed. His Excellency nearly fainted. After some time, Edwin received an invitation to a ball from the imperial family and ordered it to be burned. Seth knew they had some important announcement to make, and that the head of each family had to attend, but the hero decided to ignore it all as he burned the invitation. The butler recalled the recent rumors that Lady Peyton was having vision problems due to the after effects of a fever. Upon also learning that there had been a collapse at the Ilia mine owned by Duke Peyton, Edwin considered it a suspicious coincidence. Of course, it could just be a coincidence, but probably someone had simply started to act. Seth wanted to investigate further, but the hero decided it wasn't worth it. Besides, he already knew who was involved. It was someone who wished to establish connections with the imperial family, and at the same time strip a noble family of all its power. Determined to continue reviewing letters, the Duke heard that he had been sent an invitation to a gardening fair, clicking his tongue. He didn't understand why they kept inviting him there. The butler decided it should also be burned, but suddenly Edwin snatched the letter from his hands. After thinking for a moment, a brilliant idea occurred to him. At that moment, the heroine was experimenting with stones and was surprised by the properties of the black opal. Normally, gems stop absorbing energy upon activation, but the opal continued to do so. Moreover, it had a mark that didn't appear on the other gems after activation. Some gems were even difficult to identify, and Angelica attributed this to it being an insufficient gem. She jumped abruptly from her spot and shouted, determined that even if she didn't have all the abilities, they hadn't been taken from her. At that moment, the Duke leaned toward her, eager to know what had upset his fiancée. Seeing him appear again, she screamed and was startled by the surprise. The hero didn't understand what she was afraid of since he had promised not to kill her, but she just hoped he would knock on the door from now on. Considering her very fearful, he decided to shout before entering, just in case. Afterward, he discovered she had almost finished examining the gems he had brought. Previously, Angelica had hoped they would all stay with her, but the Duke suddenly decided he could take some of them. The reason being that she couldn't activate all those gems at the same time anyway. After a few seconds, she made her decision, and after that, Edwin took the rest. At that moment, the heroine thought that she should have taken the most valuable ones and not worried so much. Suddenly, the hero wanted to clarify if the girl liked flowers. Upon receiving an affirmative answer, he took out an invitation to the Rubierne gardening fair. Upon hearing his words and seeing the invitation, Angelica felt an electric shock run through her entire body. The gardening fair was the place where the destinies of the novel's characters would intertwine. However, she pretended not to understand, and the Duke began to clarify that it was something like a flower festival. Edwin sincerely hoped that his fiancée would agree to accompany him and attend the fair together. The protagonist was afraid to travel to the capital where the imperial family resides, but it was a great opportunity to obtain the Saphiro sword. For her life with the Duke to be normal, she had to attend that fair. Seeing that she was pondering, Edwin hugged her tightly and decided that she simply had to state her decision. After a brief silence, she quietly expressed her desire to go there with him. It surprised her that someone who hates the imperial family would value her opinion on the matter so much. In those moments, Angelica intensely wished to be selfish, but for his sake, she couldn't run away anyway. That's why she firmly decided she wanted to attend the garden fair with Duke Crawford. At the same time, she hoped Edwin would acknowledge the possibility of encountering the imperial family. In reality, they irritated the hero, as the magpie's continuous visits were more than enough. However, his fiancée wished to be there, and that's why they were traveling without objection. The young woman blushed at those words and sincerely thanked the Duke. Looking at her with a thoughtful smile, the hero didn't understand if that was all not understanding what she could offer him. A person who had fallen from the sky empty-handed. He decided to clarify what she meant with the same smile and a wink. Edwin ran his fingers across her cheek. Now the protagonist already regretted having paid attention to him and catching his insinuation. But the Duke had made such an important decision for her, so she kissed him on the cheek with all honesty. The hero looked very bewildered after that, and it suddenly seemed strange to him. He decided to ask what material his fiancée was made of. Her caresses filled him up even though he hadn't eaten anything. Besides, his head was spinning and his heart was pounding in his chest. Suddenly, he moved so close to her face that he was just a clumsy movement away from kissing her. Seeing him lean slowly towards her, Angelina instantly closed her eyes and concluded that she wasn't yet emotionally ready for it. And at the most critical moment, they heard a servant's voice, who came to announce the return of the captain of the sharks. The Duke instantly ordered him to wait in the hall while the protagonist slowly recovered from the shock. After a while, she sat at a garden table and began to calm her nerves with aromatic tea and delicious pastries. Many events would take place in the imperial capital, so they had to prepare properly. Besides, they would surely meet the Peyton family there. At this point in the book, Evelyn suffers the consequences of a fever. But this illness isn't actually what it seems. Rather, the situation is much more serious. The ailment is much worse than a common cold and has grave consequences. The cause is the poisonous acra plant. Moreover, Evelyn did not get sick by chance, as the entire process was carefully planned by someone. Only towards the end of the story will Duke Peyton discover the one responsible for robbing his daughter of her peaceful sleep. In reality, Angelina didn't want to get involved in this battle, as her priority was to survive. However, they had to find a way to overcome Evelyn's illness, to retrieve the Zephyr sword, which is located on their property. The only question is how the protagonist can cure the young woman without revealing her power. Looking up at the sky, she saw the scorching setting sun which always blazed with intensity. Suddenly, a brilliant idea crossed her mind, and Angelina didn't hesitate to begin preparations. First, she ordered Jenny to take her to Zeta's room immediately. Meanwhile, Kiwi cupped His Highness's head in his hands, determined to stay by his side and protect him. However, he knew everything was fine, and Edwin didn't understand why he was so worried. Besides, he now had the protagonist, so there was no reason to be uneasy. On one hand, Kiwi was sincerely happy that the young woman was now with the Duke. On the other hand, he and the others had no idea where the warrior had come from. He investigated this case in other countries, but still found nothing about her. After that, he began to look for information about the Tomb Raiders. Rumor has it that in the desert of Mujas, where Ambria is located, Ancient treasures are also hidden. There are several versions, but the most likely one claims that they are precious stones. Edwin considered it quite banal, but Hughie hurried to add that of course they were strange stones. According to legend, there is a mysterious gemstone there that feels like a living flower to the touch. There are also those who believe that in the ancient kingdom of Yucatan, it was considered sacred. Upon hearing the conclusion, from the soldier that the imperial family is probably looking for this stone, the Duke decided to find out where he got that idea. It turns out there were various theories and speculations that would arise and disappear. But as soon as they died down, someone would reignite them, and as soon as rumors about the desert began to circulate, the crows moved immediately. Edwin was sure that all of this had some connection to Jewel. The imperial family exterminated that race, and now they were looking for the treasures they left behind. But it wasn't clear why. If the hypothesis is correct, the cause of the genocide was not just to eliminate the Crawfords. The Duke ordered Hughie to find out everything he could about this mysterious stone. Meanwhile, a butler arrived unexpectedly with a report. Seth decided to confess that a few minutes ago, the lady had asked him for a favor. Upon learning that she wanted to prepare a gift for him, Edwin froze, beaming with joy. He didn't understand why all of a sudden, but according to Hugo, you don't need a reason for gifts. The butler also clarified that the lady wanted to surprise His Grace. He looked thoughtfully at Seth, intrigued by what kind of gift it would be. Then the butler handed him a rolled-up scroll with the design for the gift. From any angle you looked at it, all the lines looked like normal glasses.